Okay, so we'll go back then. If there's no other discussion, we'll go back to the public forum and we'll start with Jonathan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to read this to be quicker. I oppose any hybrid city ward model where some wards have one councilor and others two. I can understand how such a model might make sense to a city councilor who argues that equity is reached when each councilor represents the same number of residents. As a resident, I argue that equity is reached where each resident is represented by the same number of councilors. Anything else is unfair. Analogies to our state legislature, where the number of representatives is constitutionally fixed and the representative bodies are much larger, do not resonate in a small community like ours. Besides, just because they do it doesn't mean it is just. We should not need to resort to this sort of technical solution when simpler, fairer ones are available. Mayoral vetoes should not defer the city council from doing the right thing, as long as you make a decision the community broadly supports. It should be pretty straightforward to override them. Either the mayor will not veto it if it's got broad support, or it'll be easily overridable. So let's keep this simple. We don't want to spend the next 10 years hindsighting an innovative, clever redistricting plan. A hybrid model might be popular with some folks today, but you're making a decision for residents who haven't moved here yet. Keep it simple. What is simpler and more just than one person, one vote? Thank you.
Okay, next is Sharon Busher.
Thank you. Good morning. Robert Bristow Johnson did a wonderful job of blanketing all the people who had been part of the redistricting working group or committees prior to the time it arrived at the council. And so he sent out information about this meeting. And people responded to all, as sometimes they do, where most of the people that responded could not attend because of the time. And so once again, I am asking, even though I know this is a working group, not a formal committee of the city council, I'm hoping that subsequent meetings, and I don't know how many you have thought you need to talk about this item, would be at times that might be able to be attended by more people. I'm going to stay for just a portion, then I have to drop off because I work also. But I am glad to end. I am glad that the council is doing this. I had wanted the council to have such a working group to start sorting through this. It's complicated. I've been in this community for a long time. People identify with where they go to vote, their polling place. They identify with their neighbors and their existing boundaries. I've been involved where I've had to change boundaries. It was painful. And some people never forgave and felt alienated as a result. So I'm just offering those past experiences and requesting that other meetings might be held where more people from outside of the committee could attend. But I applaud you, and I'm so appreciative that you all are taking this on. Thank you.
Okay, next is Barbara Hendrick.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I first want to say that I'm really against the 2 8-ward maps made by the city, because option 1 is still the salamander where 95% of the residents are students, either on or off campus. Similarly, the city 8-ward map option 2, I'm very much against, because 85% of that ward's population is students on or off campus. So neither of those 2 8-ward maps are appealing. They're very problematic when you have a ward that has a super majority of on and off campus students. And I'm wondering why is this group not using better 8-ward maps? The independent mapping group provided a map to you in August. It's called option F as in Frank 2, that equally balances the on-campus population between wards 6 and ward 1. And it gets rid of this super majority student ward. I'd like to see that map included in the maps that City Council will eventually vote on. And I'm just suspect that you're putting out 2 horrible 8-ward maps to eliminate the possibility of having 16 city councilors, because I know there are a number of city councilors very much against having that many. And it seems to me that not a good way to put the best maps forward. So I'd like to see the independent mapping groups option F2 map put forward, because it solves some of the problems that are in the city's 8-ward maps. 2, I'm wondering who is driving the decision or making it so that there's not an equal distribution of the on-campus students between wards 1 and 6. Who takes ownership of that? Because it seems like every map is putting those 4,400 students in ward 6. Yes, this new 7-ward map that has 12 city councilors does that, but there are better ways. There are ways you can distribute those students equally between wards. And I just want to know, what is the rationale for not sharing it, and who takes ownership for that trend I'm seeing in all the maps? Third, I'd like to provide some suggestions for the 7-ward, 12-councilor map, and that is that the downtown ward not come all the way up to South Prospect. Instead, those UVM administrative buildings that are on the block between South Prospect, Pearl, Main, and Williams, that should be in Ward 1, because those UVM decisions affecting the campus green and that block affect Ward 1 and Ward 6, and not so much a downtown neighborhood. And the way that can be done is if the downtown ward goes all the way over to King Street and up to Edmonds, then it can drop that UVM administration block and give it to Ward 1. Also, last, why don't you consider a 8-ward, 14-councilor map? That would allow for the sharing of the athletic campus with Ward 1 and still have a downtown ward. Thank you very much for considering these comments.
Okay, last hand is Robert Bristow Johnson. And if anybody else that's here has not spoken yet, please raise your hand if you would like to.
Hello. So I'm just going to comment a little bit about our present system and also what I remember anyway from the redistricting committee, the ad hoc committee meetings. It was pretty unanimous. Everybody hated the Salamander ward. And that's something that I needed to hear, of course. But the opposition to there were a couple of comments about the district councilors, but the opposition to that was much more muted, because I think sometimes people saw how that compromise came about and what was to be gained from it. It allowed us to have 8 wards and not go to 16 councilors, and not pack so many primates into the cage. And so it's something to think about. And another issue that can be related is we're discussing polling places and whether or not the polling places have to be in the ward or not, and even how many polling places we're going to get, and what the effect of mail-in voting is, which is becoming more widespread. And it might be that the way to solve a lot of these problems is to save money, is to go to 4 polling places citywide. each polling place would cover 2 wards. It would be like a 2-ward district. In fact, it could be the same as a 2-ward district if we were to go to an 8-12 model. We'd have 4 district clerks. We'd have 12 inspectors of election, but then we could still hire as many poll workers as we need to run these polls, larger polling places efficiently, but they might not be that much larger because it might be that, 70%, 80% of the people will vote by mail. And so if the question ever gets down to 8-16 versus 8-12, I think you should consider the possibility that 8-12 can solve more problems besides just not increasing the size of council to a difficult size for it. You just might not have a lot of elbow room. That's something that you need to think about. You need to think about how long your council meetings are going to be. And you need to think about how efficient government will be run. Just consider that. Consider having 4 polling places citywide and 1 polling place for each pair of wards, whatever we call that district. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, next we have Chris Hazley.
Hey, everybody. Am I visible? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
So just before I get into my substantive comments on redistricting, I also wanted to point out one of the points from a previous speaker about the timing of the meeting. I had to duck out of the Marketplace Commission a little early to attend here. So I think an evening time frame, not during the workday, would be helpful moving forward if we could get a couple of those scheduled. Secondly, with respect to the meeting experience on Zoom, I think it would be helpful to be able to see the other meeting participants that are in. Typically, if you come to an in-person meeting, you can look around the room and kind of see who's there. And it just feels very closed off here on Zoom. And I've talked to a number of folks who share that as well. So I wanted to point that out. As for the redistricting stuff, the 7x12 map that Ms. Stetson put together, I like it. A couple of suggested changes would be to extend the boundary with the downtown ward in the Old North End westward to the lake. That's the historical boundary. And then I concur with Mr. Hedrick's comments about the need to move the census block containing the Waterman building and some of the institutional buildings back into Ward 1 to keep it with the campus. My recollection is the only residential property in that block is the Sigma Phi fraternity house. So I think impact would be minimal there. Larger sense, I think one of the things that we had heard from folks, last fall, almost a year ago, was the desire to move to a model with, at least 2 counselors per ward. And while I commend folks for taking the initiative to try to be creative here to get past some of these issues that we're dealing with, that is something I'm still hearing from folks about that. So that is, as you know, the disadvantage of the 7x12 model. From my perspective, I've tried to, when I've done maps, tried to focus on statutory criteria, primarily population. And I think that to the extent that the council focuses on statutory criteria, I think it'll be, an easier road to hoe, so to speak. I think that what I'm seeing, really the big question is how many wards, and 7 and 8 are popular. I've heard some 6. But I think that that's probably a question is, there. But again, there's, when you factor in the number of counselors per ward, there's going to be some challenges there. And I think that at the end of the day, this is a very difficult decision because every one of the 3 options put forth is going to have some type of impact on one or more parts of the city. The obvious being with an 8-ward map, there's going to have to be some changes to Ward 1. With a 7-ward map, there's be changes to the Old North End. And with the 7x12 hybrid proposal, there's concerns about, the staggering of the terms and the equal representation. So I would also respectfully disagree with my colleague, Mr. Bristow Johnson, about the need to preserve the current 8x12 model. There was substantive public comment last fall in opposition to the district counselors for a number of reasons I think that have already been communicated. But I would say in closing that I think, given that all of the quantifiable data we have on this issue is almost a year old, I think it would be helpful to have some more current data, particularly as the council and the community heads into this final stretch of the discussion. I think a year ago, this wasn't really on the radar. There were other issues, I think, that were taking precedence, perhaps, or attention. And I think folks may be a little more tuned in now than they may have been a year ago. So I think you might be helpful in that regard to continue to get some public feedback moving forward. So thank you for your time, and good luck with your work session today. Thank you.
Okay, that's all that we see for public forum.
Can I ask one quick clarifying question real quick before we leave the public, which is, Barbara, you said something about the 7, you said something at the very end about an 8-14 or something like that. Can you just clarify what you meant with that?
Yes. So it's just, it's another version of the 7-12. So it's a hybrid. So if you decide not to go with 7-12 because you think it's unfair that some wards will only have one counselor, then you won't want an 8-14. And 8-14 would be based on having 7 ward size populations, but 2 wards would be half of that.
Got it.
I
Okay.
drew one. So if you want to see it, I can send it to you. And whoever
Great.
wants it. Do you want to see it, or?
I think maybe let's see how the discussion goes, and if we decide to eliminate any of the one wards.
Right. That makes sense.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Can I?
Sorry about that, Barbara. I just was switching your setting, and so you got muted right as you were starting to speak again. I don't know, counselors, if you want to take any more back and forth or any more public comment before you transition into your discussion.
I don't mind. I don't want to just cut Barbara off. So I don't know if Mark or Ben feel differently.
If Barbara has more comment to add, I'd like to hear that as well.
Okay, sorry about that, Barbara.
No problem. Thank you. So I just have a question about this 7-12 map, the way Ward 7 is. It looks like Ward 7 is completely surrounded by Ward 4. And that looks like it might be gerrymandered. I don't know if it is. I don't know the New North End that well, but that neighborhood to be entirely an island just looks, it raises a red flag. So maybe you could talk about that.
Okay,
Thank
yeah, I think that's something we could speak to as Nancy walks through the presentation. In terms of, I know that there were a couple things that I was just going to speak to kind of to tee up Nancy's presentation for the counselors. One is just thanks to everyone for being here. I know this time in the middle of the day isn't ideal. The counselors have a deadline of just a couple weeks from now to help produce some map clarity for the rest of the city council. And just looking out to scheduling, a lot of them are busy with other evening commitments as well for their other committee work. So we were just having trouble finding an evening that was free. So that was a big part of what drove scheduling this meeting during the day. The other piece that I'll just say, there were some questions about the versions of maps that have been provided by the city. Because we have been trying to work through this process with the council in large group council meetings, we have not spent a lot of time refining some of the initial takes on maps that the city provided back in the spring until we're able to get a stronger sense of kind of clarity and priority for some of these maps. So while you have been receiving iterations and refinements from the independent mapping group and others in Burlington, we have been taking a look at them, but we have not been dedicating a lot of staff time to making significant changes to the original group of maps that were shared with you until we know more a better sense of how the council wants to move forward. So part of the intent of this group is to hear more about the priorities for which maps the council would like to see iterated and get more into the weeds on how we can do that. So I think that speaks to some of the questions that you heard just now. And I do see one other hand, so I'll go back to Robert, and then just in the interest of time, since we're only scheduled till 11:30, I'd recommend that we start kind of moving into the discussion of the different map options. So Robert, you should be set again. Robert? If you are trying to speak, you're still on mute, Robert.
So maybe we go ahead with, oh, there he is.
Oh, it looks like he just dropped off actually, so he might have had some challenges with his Zoom. Okay, I think at this point, Nancy, do you want to walk through the presentation that you prepared for the counselors?
Sure, I can do that. Okay, see my screen? Yes? Okay, great. I'll just make it big. Okay, now I see it on like 3 different screens in front of me. I don't know why. Okay, so what I was hoping to do with this presentation is to take a big step back and try to narrow down our options, as Megan was sort of pointing to. So my hope with this working group meeting is that as a group, you can agree on 1 or 2 options for number of wards versus number of counselors. And from there, we can use the following meeting to really dig into exactly where the lines should be, you know, how we want to actually make those. But in each option has a lot of different variations within it. So we need a little more focus to like get to a final map. And the reason I'm hoping to do it this way is as Megan said, we don't have a lot of time before
Nancy, really quick, I think if you're scrolling through your slides, we're not seeing that.
Really?
I'd say just stop your screen share, and then you can just walk us through the slides in this PowerPoint frame that we're looking at.
Okay, stop my screen share.
Or stop presenting. I mean, stop presenting the slides. There we go. Now we can see our cursor, and yeah, there we go. All right.
Okay, I don't know why it does that. Anyways, this was the slide I was just talking about that I thought you saw. And then, thanks, Megan. And so what I was about to say was that this is what I'm hoping the schedule will look like so that we can get final maps done for October 11th to be presented at the October 17th meeting. So that means this meeting today, and then hopefully just 1 additional meeting, either the end of the week in late September or early October. So that will give time to make a bunch of different map options within the ward counselor that you aim for, and then after that second meeting, make any refinements that are needed. So the way I'm going to work through this is to first, again, take this big step back and think about all the different priorities we've heard over the past year about what the community and counselors and the mayor want a new map to look like. So first of all, we just have what is required by law for a new map. So it needs to be within a 10% deviation, generally following neighborhood boundaries, and compact are the most basic requirements. Oh, and I forgot to say, this presentation is posted online, both on the redistricting page and on board docs, if you want to flip through it yourself. So then the ad hoc committee had a few different priorities that they raised. As we've all heard, there's issues with the way Ward 8 works currently. There's a feeling that the ward district system isn't working, and there was a request for 6 to 8 wards from that committee. Then over the spring and summer, the city council and the mayor have weighed in on certain priorities that they'd like to see. You can see the list of them here. The one thing I would say is that not all of these priorities work together. Some of them directly conflict, some conflict in certain instances. But I just want to put them all in one place so you can see sort of the different things we've heard about what a map should look like. And then finally, there were some considerations of election administration, so that if the ward boundaries generally follow the state district boundaries, it makes it easier for election administration. And then I actually added, I think it's worth considering prioritizing simple boundaries so that people know where their ward is and know sort of how they are divided. That goes along with following neighborhood boundaries. So the city council so far has considered these 5 map options. And these are combinations of wards and councilors, and you've seen some sample maps for each of these. I do want to stress that, like what Megan said, we haven't done a lot of refining within these because there hasn't been much agreement about what direction between these we'd like to take. And so that's what I'm hoping to get to today, is to try to either eliminate some that we definitely don't want or have some agreement so that we can get down to 1 or 2 that you think are feasible and possible. And because I am a visual person, I wanted to see how these options compared to the priorities all in one place. So I put together this matrix of all the sort of summary of what the crucial priorities are compared to the different options. The caveats I would say up front are that the priorities are not sorted at all, and you may think some of them are not priorities at all, and some of them should be higher. It's up to the councilors to decide how they rank them and which they deem important. You can read this in sort of 2 different ways. You can read it horizontally to see sort of which priorities are easier to achieve, and you can also look vertically to understand sort of how well each map performs against different priorities and which ones, you know, sort of satisfy the most. You can see that red are maps that do not satisfy the priority at all. And then it ranges through yellow, which is like sort of neutral, or it depends on the circumstance, versus the darker green, which is, it does satisfy that. I'm gonna pause here to take questions. I think there's sort of, from here, there's 2 different ways we could go through. I've included a bunch of different options for maps that I've seen either from the community or the ones presented from the city council to give you an idea of what the maps could look like. But again, I don't want to get into, like, you know, certain streets moving from ward to ward. I think we could also talk through sort of which priorities are the most important to you and sort of try to narrow down the maps from there. So I'm going to pause to see if anyone has questions.
I don't have a question, but I love the sort of graphical representation that you've created here to sort of frame the discussion.
Thanks. The other actual caveat I wanted to say about this was that the colors are not set in stone. So it's if you disagree with how the colors are or the maps are prioritized, like, that's understandable. Some of them are a bit subjective.
Councilor Hightower, I saw that you came off mute. Did you have any questions or reactions?
I don't have questions. Yeah, I think it's more if we were talking about how to move forward. But yeah, appreciate this analysis.
I had one question about the, in terms of map making, if 8 wards was something we wanted to consider, would we necessarily have to consider the council size question at this meeting, since a 12 or 16 council map would essentially be the same with the addition of the overlays for the districts in a 12 councilor version. So maybe we could defer that if it would be helpful to the discussion. But I would also want to hear what councilors Hightower and Traverse want to say about that.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if I want to set it aside as much because I feel like it's still part of the discussion, but I guess maybe I'll just start talking about where I'm at and we'll see if that's helpful or not. But I think I still really like the 712 map, but I think I've heard from enough folks. I also put this in the on my front porch forum a couple times, that folks do have concerns with the 1 versus 2 councilor representation. And I'm like, I think it's smaller than the 8+4, which I appreciate, but I'm not sure that it actually, like, one of the reasons we said we didn't like the 8+4 was that it had like different numbers of councilors at different numbers of constituents. And that doesn't actually get rid of that, while adding the problem of having different numbers of representatives. So I feel like, even though I know that there's a lot of people who like the actual neighborhoods on this 7 ward 12 councilor map, I do think it creates enough equity issues that I would be okay maybe dropping that one off the get-go if others are. I'll leave it there.
I'd be
I would-
curious to hear, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
You haven't spoken yet, so go ahead.
Well, I'd be curious to hear from Nancy as to sort of what the 2 directions are here as to your proposal as to how we move forward. I tend to agree with Councilor Hightower. I'm glad that we've gone through the exercise of the 7 ward 12 councilor map. But personally, after thinking about it and after hearing from a number of constituents and other folks, I'm not sure it's one that I'm interested in our further pursuing. I do believe personally that we should do everything we can to find a map that has equal representation within each of the wards. So if that provides some clarity as to where we move forward from here, to me, I think that it's a map we can take off the table. But look, I'm also mindful that there's, as we move forward here, going to be certain realities associated with which maps have a politically feasible path forward. I think that that's just a reality that we need to acknowledge in this process, and that's how we ended up with the 7 ward 12 councilor map to begin with, if we're being frank. And so I think that while I don't see myself supporting a 7 ward 12 councilor map, I think it's also important that we obviously come to some understanding as to where we are on the other maps before we completely knock it out.
I was also going to suggest that we take the 12-12 off the table. We haven't talked much about it since the first redistricting work session. It has it clearly through this matrix, it has 3 does not meets, and I don't know that it has enough support to really advance. So I guess I would suggest we take that one off as well.
I think I want to hear a little bit more about the issues with it, just because I know there are a lot of people who do really like it. And I think some of the things like more than 1 councilor per ward, I think people maybe care more about people having equal representation. and then students distributed across wards. Again, I feel like if there's one that's truly just students, I feel people feel differently about that than one that's mostly students, where they feel like they're a minority in their ward. And so I think some of the reason that we took that one off isn't the red things here, but it's like the election problems. And I guess I just want to shake that. I want to be able to tell people why we took this one off, like practically before I am willing to let it go completely. So if we can just have that discussion for 3 minutes, I think I'd feel better about it.
Yeah, so just like hearing everybody's first reaction to this, I was going to suggest, so Nancy does have some slides that follow that look at each of these different configurations and talk a little bit more about, zoom in on some of these priorities that each of the configurations help meet and some of the places where they're challenging. So I don't know if it would be helpful to continue on with that, or do you want to skip just to the 12 by 12 and talk about that one, or do you want to go through all of them?
I'm fine with going through all of them, maybe skipping the 7 and 12 since we've already talked about it. And just want to note that Robert Bristow Johnson just wrote in the questions, because I know not everybody can, not the attendees can't see this, that there is no 12 ward map that will satisfy the 10% ODE limit, which Nancy's making a face at because I think she drew one.
All right.
And it may be a nuance that like, maybe there isn't one that helps satisfy something that is palatable or has broad support, maybe is a caveat there, but go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, I drew that map in May. I think it satisfied the 10% deviation, but I would want to talk to Robert more about why he thinks it doesn't. But if it's all right with everyone, I'll go through the maps relatively quickly, skipping the 712. So this is the 714 that I drew again back in May. I would say as we saw, the main issue with this configuration is the split between the new North End and the old North End. I think otherwise this could potentially work, but I think we've heard a lot that people really don't want these two neighborhoods to be put together. Here's another option from Robert, just to show other ways the wards could be configured.
I think this one in particular, Nancy, was also one that minimized the impact and of the encroachment of the new North End into the traditionally, what's considered the old North End, and tried to extend that creep closer to the west side there.
Right. From what I remember, the issue is that it still pulls in, like there's a fair amount of people in that old North End corner. It's a small corner, but it's I think around 2,000 people that live there, so it's fairly substantial. This is one more. This was drawn by Jay Appleton, who was in this mapping specialist role and has since retired. Again, just in this map, he actually takes some of the old North End in both Ward 4 and 7 to make it work. This also shows, Ward 1 getting that a slice of the UVM dorms there.
And the only thing I'll say is that one of the challenges with this kind of iteration, while it maintains a pretty clean split down the avenue between wards 4 and 7, you'll notice that it actually picks up population in Ward 7 over near the Integrated Arts Academy. So it actually kind of like physically separates the piece of the old North End that's pulled in from, it's not contiguous, I guess is what I'm saying. So the point of these three options is just to illustrate that you really can't get to 7 without combining portions of these two neighborhoods somehow.
Oh, I'm gonna actually switch around. So next up are the 8 ward maps. To Councilor Barlow's point, I do think it's true that the 8 ward map, as long as there's equal councilors, it could be decided later whether you want a district system or 16 councilors. That seems possible to me. this is one option I drew again back in May. I didn't even include the one that like didn't make changes to Ward 8 because no one liked that one. Another option here from Jay where it's not so different. Ward 8 sort of stretches out along that sort of, I guess, hill section area. And then here's one more from Robert Bristow Johnson. This one splits up, I believe it splits up the large UVM block so that Ward 1 gets some of those dorms. I would just note that if Ward 1 gets the student dorms, then that other boundary has to shift back away from Willard Street, or I'm not sure exactly where it is in the other plans, but shift back like towards Trinity campus and changes the shape of Ward 2 as well. And then here's, oh, we already saw this one. And then we have the 12 ward map. This one I drew again in May. I would say the main challenge with this map is having a entirely student ward in that Ward 8. And I think it's not just that it's entirely students, but from what I understand, it's almost entirely young students, like freshmen and sophomore students. And so the challenge of just having a counselor be elected, having people to staff the elections as well. There's a lot of challenges in that. And then it does change. I would absolutely, if this ends up being an option, I would like to do some refinements. It does change the actual ward boundaries quite a bit, and I'd want to make some adjustments there.
Yeah, and question here, and then I'm gonna have to grab my cord. Right, so I think what I understood it to be is the election, not just the counselor, it basically would have to be a sophomore who runs in order to stay through their senior year, essentially both as a counselor and as a school board member. Which I think to me is the bigger concern than even just like, because if there was something where like SGA was like supporting like the elections or something like that, I think that's possible, but I think I'm concerned about it, like a junior essentially couldn't run because they would have to find a way to stay on campus past their senior year, which I think that's, unless that, and so that's the logic that I'm coming to, and unless people feel like that's not true or problematic in one case, I would want to hear that. I think that's a good enough justification.
I mean, I do think that one of the things that we've seen as just a challenge with some of these wards is just how small they get. And that issue that you just highlighted, Counselor Hightower, is an important one, not only because we don't, and the students to some degree don't really have control over their placement in the dorms. You know, it's possible that even if, you know, a freshman or a sophomore that's living in one of those locations could get elected, but then not get housing in that same part of campus the next year. So that could be a challenge for them, just given how small some of these wards have to be in a 12 ward configuration. And that applies off campus as well, actually, to some of the adjacent areas where students often live off campus.
Is it worth also speaking to the challenge of finding election workers? I know that Keith Pillsbury in particular has written about that via email. And although I don't know all the particulars, he's expressed difficulty finding people for inspectors of election and just to manage the election process in a predominantly student ward.
I do think that's a little unfair, because I think if it were truly an all student ward, I think that it's different when it's 60-40 or something 70-30, because then you don't, like, I don't think students are like, oh, this is our ward, even though they are predominantly in this ward. Whereas I think if we had one that was just students, there would be a sense of ownership over that. That said, I think the other, like, even if that were the case, I think the other issues are maybe great enough that that's not, yeah.
And just for what it's worth, I completely agree with Counselor Hightower's points, and those are my concerns with this map as well, in addition to those that Nancy flagged in her matrix there. The other thing that I can tell you, because we're dealing with it on the charter change committee, is that as our charter is currently written, we are mandated to have polling locations in each of our wards. The charter change committee is currently thinking about whether to propose an amendment to the charter that would allow for us to consolidate polling locations. We heard from Robert Bristow Johnson, why don't we have 4 polling locations throughout the city? Sarah Carpenter on the Charter Change Committee has talked about, well, if we are going to build this brand new high school, wouldn't that be a great place for both wards 4 and 7 to vote? But as our charter is written right now, we have to have a polling location in Ward 4 and in Ward 7. And unless we make that change, a 12-ward map, we'd have to find 12 different locations around the city to run locations within the boundaries of each ward. And at the moment, I don't think that's realistic if we're looking at this map. I mean, even Ward 12, which is where I live, I think there's some places there, but we certainly wouldn't have Burlington Electric any longer, which is where we vote right now.
Right. Okay. So unless I don't hear, I mean, I don't know that folks have access to the chat. Maybe they just have things in the Q&A, but I guess then we are kind of unanimously decided, both as a council group and as for the folks and attendees, that maybe this isn't, that won't work. So, okay, I'm convinced. And then in terms of taking off other things, I mean, I think when we proposed the 7-ward map very early, and again, like for Ward 1, obviously, the 7-ward map is great, but there is the problem that I think it is unfair, kind of per Joan's point. It would be one thing, I feel like I would feel more comfortable telling people like, oh, your voting location is going to change, but like, other things, I do think it feels a little unfair to have this really close-knit neighborhood. Sorry, I'm talking about the Ward 7 map now. Put into like the new North End, which is just very, very different. Like, that old North End block is very dense, close to downtown, just has such a different feel than the new North End, that I think putting just a few people into Ward 7, I would be much more comfortable if it was split 50-50 and it was just about a polling place. But I think this is really about preserving neighborhoods, which I think is kind of the #1 thing we should be looking out for. So I like the 7, from my selfish Ward 1 perspective, like the 7-ward map, but I think both how much we heard from folks who were in that little piece that's now being put into the new North End, I don't think it's a fair map in terms of disadvantaging just a small group of people.
Yeah, without the hybrid model where the wards have different numbers of people representing them and different populations within them, it does mean that it can be possible to preserve some neighborhoods in some parts of the city, but not, necessarily neighborhoods in other parts, like the exact trade-off that you're talking about, where Ward 1 is largely unchanged, but Ward 1 of the new North End and old North End wards changes. And that's just really due to kind of how our population growth has changed in different parts of the city.
I think it says a lot about getting rid of single family zoning and getting some more people to move into the new North End, but that's a different discussion. So. Mark or Ben, did you have?
Well, so to me, this has been helpful to refine the discussion a little bit. Nancy, I don't want to step in the way of your next steps here necessarily, but this is sort of where I'm at. So the 7-ward 14 councillor map, for me personally, checks a lot of boxes. That said, I've heard 2 concerns that I think are worth our further exploring, perhaps with respect to map making here, right? One is what Zariah just pointed out, and what we continue to hear, right, which is sort of the border between the old North End and new North End. And I get it. right? It's going to be impossible to not extend some of the old North End into whatever ward is in the new North End. I mean, I understand those concerns. I'm also mindful of the fact that the version of the map that we had before the map we have right now did that. So folks who have been long-term residents of the city are used to that, but that's part of the reason why we ended up with the map we have right now. I believe I was not here the last time we went through this process. I will also say I'm mindful of the fact that the House district combines some of the old North End and new North End. But I understand that concern. The other concern that I've heard from folks in this call, as well as other constituents, I will tell you, I went to the mayor's coffee that he did in Ward 6 yesterday morning, and there were a number of people there who were concerned about whether a 7-ward map or any map that we're looking at is going to shift sort of the Ward 8 problem, for lack of a better term, into Ward 6. And if we want to, get rid of the Salamander ward because the percentage of students is too high, do we have a map that is, just sort of shifting that same issue into Ward 6? So if we were to proceed with a 7-ward 14 councillor map, I suppose what I would want to see is the map that sort of limits the old North End, new North End blend to the greatest extent possible, right? And even if that means ensuring that the 2 new North End wards are on, sort of the lowest possible end of our percentage deviation here, if that's a direction to go in. And then I would also want to confirm that a 7-ward map like that is fairly distributing the student population. But if we're putting that one aside, then that pretty much is ultimately going to take us to an 8-ward map, right? And I'm about to bring some political considerations back into play here. The mayor has made very clear that he is not going to support an 8-ward 16 councillor map. I know Mark suggested that we not talk about the size of the council in this discussion, but I do think it's a reality that we need to consider here. That the mayor has very clearly said that he's not going to support an 8-ward 16 councillor map. My preference would be for us to find a map that we can come to some common consensus on and not have to have a vote as a council to override a mayoral veto on a redistricting map. But if that's ultimately what we came to here, then we would need 8 councillors to support an 8-ward 16 councillor map and 8 folks who are willing to override a mayoral veto. I believe the mayor has made clear that he would veto that map. So just talking about this realistically, where that ultimately brings us to is an 8-ward 4-district map if we're to maintain 12 people on the council. And I totally understand the concerns with respect to the districts, but I just think it's important that we put that all on the table now for the purposes of our discussion as to where we head here. Because I think if I'm thinking about this realistically, if we are to take those concerns about the 7-ward 14 councillor map into account to put that one off the table, and I think the map that has the most realistic path forward in the council configuration that has the most realistic path forward is to maintain the status quo while also getting rid of the Salamander ward, maintain the district model, and more fairly distribute the student population. I don't love it for lots of reasons, but I just think it's important to put that out there.
One comment on the 7-ward is I feel like I think about it almost the opposite that you do, where you're like, oh, try to make it as few people as possible who are in the new North. And then to me, it's almost like that would be worse, right? If you're like the one street that like it got pulled into, I feel like it's almost the opposite. I also feel like there is like with the deviation problem, it's funny because this is where I disagree with Keith completely, because he's very upset with Ward 8. He's like, there's like 2 kids that are being represented by the whoever the school board. I'm like, okay, so those kids are overrepresented, not underrepresented. But I think that's the same, like with the thing about like, I feel this way, I guess, a little bit about Ward 1 is because Ward 1 is so much larger than it's supposed to be, and it's still just represented by me, right? Those people they're not getting their like fair share of representation, I get, right? Because they're splitting it across more. And I think when we start to mess with the deviations too much, like giving the new North End, like making it so much smaller, those people would be overrepresented, which is a tough way to start out if we don't expect large growth. If we, like Jean's point of like, if we're expecting growth in the city, we expect there to be a whole bunch built in the new North End relative to the rest of the city, that would feel different to me because that's like a balancing act. But if this is a shrinking part of the city and we're already starting by making it overrepresented, that feels like, what's the deviation going to be in 10 years? And then we're just pushing a problem that is getting worse to like down the hill to deal with later. The 8 were talking about the politics of it. I think I would have felt better about trying to override the veto if I just had to convince Ben and Mark to do it. But at this point, with us being an 11-person council, there's only 3 people who can vote against this, which is very few. So I definitely feel like we need a backup plan if that doesn't happen, because otherwise we'll start really going into some deadlines. I don't know if it's good strategy to go to the mayor and be like, here's the plan we want that we know you're going to veto, and we've got a backup plan once you do that. But yeah, so I guess I just don't know what it means to just have the 8x2 and then what that means for what's next. But I feel like the 8 ward map is, I'm fine with moving forward with 7 and 8, but I definitely feel like the 8 ward map is the most likely for me.
With regard, I just wanted to make one comment about growth in the new North End, is that we do have the Cambrian Rise development with, I think, over, it's several hundred units that are being created there. And I'm not even sure how many were counted, maybe only Liberty House, right, in the 2010 census. So there's already Juniper House and I forget Laurentide that have been built since then. So there is potential for growth. I also recognize in Ward 1, there's the potential for a lot of growth up on the Trinity campus as well. So there are areas of the city that will grow. So in terms of deviation, even though the new North End in some of these map configurations looks to be sort of as small as it could possibly be and still stay within the deviations allowed by law, I think that there is the knowledge that there is going to be some growth there. In terms of the districts, it's like when I looked at, if we go back to like the matrix for just a moment, which I'm sort of fixated on a little bit here, but it's like when we look down the priorities, I think one of the really important things perhaps for us to do is to sort of determine which of these priorities are the most important ones for us to preserve. We've heard lots of talk about the new North End and old North End being separate. If we determine them as a council that that's like one of the sort of immutable lines that we'll never cross, then we should make sure that whatever map we have does that, keeps those things separate. And so I wonder, in the scheme of things, where the district, no district question lies in that matrix, because it does allow you to have small wards, but it also has these bigger wards that I know that some people have exception to. So I just think, these are the criteria, these priorities that are admittedly, it says right here at the top, not sorted. If we were to sort these, I wonder if we get there, and maybe we don't need to do that. I think we're sort of talking through some of these things. I agree with those who have said that we need to more equally distribute students. If we're gonna have mixed student and resident wards, I think that the Ward 8 experience and what we've heard in some of the public comment and forums and through the ad hoc group suggests that that should be something that we want to do. In the matrix here, it looks like they all sort of, except with the exception of the 12-12, which doesn't do it at all, have challenges doing that. I do think, though, I've seen at least one version of an 8-ward map that does make an attempt to more equally distribute those students between wards 1 and ward 6. And, you know, if it's only in an 8-ward map that we can do that, I think we should definitely look at that more closely. So I guess what I'm saying in a long-winded way there is that I would definitely like to see another iteration of the 8-word map for sure, and not rule that one out. And then I didn't know if we had, I couldn't tell through the conversation whether or not Zariah or Ben were sort of suggesting that we're also maybe done with the 714 and the 712, or do we keep one of those as an alternative plan?
I think it's more unfair to be lumped into a ward that you historically don't have the same votes as, that you don't like, that just has such a different culture than to only have one representative. So I would definitely, between the 7-ward-by-2 map and the whatever 5-by-2 +1 is what I've been calling it, I would prefer the because I think we can say like, oh, like status quo, this is the fair thing to do, but I really don't think it's fair to take a group of people and put them into, I think that's just going to cause a lot of dissatisfaction, more so than just having one representative would.
Just for clarity on our end, was that, I think I was misunderstanding that perspective at the beginning. So are you saying that consideration makes you feel like 7-by-12 is more fair, or 7-by-14 is more fair, or would be your preference?
7-by-12 is more fair, but I wonder if we should just look at the 8-ward map for a while, rather than having a plan B. Just because I think it might be a little bit easier to focus on one. I also have to say for the 8-ward map, I think there might be some, like, I don't mind the idea of having more students in my ward, but I know that like there was versions that were drawn by the independent committee that really gutted Ward 1 that folks felt very strongly about, and that looks like a gerrymandered map. And I don't think that that's a good direction to go, just for folks to feel like to try to like pull into Ward 6 to do more students. I do think moving, I think there's a way to, and the other thing is I don't think we should just look at on-campus students. I think we should also look at off-campus students. Nancy, I think there was something you had, I'm pretty sure I saw something where you did that, which I think starts to make it look a little bit more even. But I think there's a way for Ward 1 to cut off some of the things that it has of north and take more of like closer to Highway 2 to get a bigger student population than to try to cross out Highway 2, which to me is when it starts to look really gerrymandered. So that's just something I would take into consideration, because I don't think like I know there was a weird one where it was like literally like a chunk of like Ward 1 felt like it looked cut out, and I don't think that's okay.
I just want to jump in. I think the student question we can get much more in detail on next week. I do think that I did not consider off-campus students when I presented like those percentages. And I do think that the issues with Ward 8 are a lot about how many off-campus students there are too. Whereas Ward 6 that includes the campus, it would be, I think that there would be a majority of that ward would be on-campus students, but there's a substantial neighborhood surrounding it that is not primarily students. And so that would make it different from the current Ward 8. And then the other thing, what you touched on is that if Ward 1 has, gets any of those dorms from south of Route 2, it would have to start, you know, that northern border would start getting like sort of carved out of Ward 1. And that's just, there's not any other borders to work with in Ward 1. So that would be a consideration.
Right. And I think that folks are, I think folks are looking a lot at on campus, and that's because we have the numbers so we can do it like exactly. But I think folks are maybe overthinking how much more Ward 6 will have in terms of a student population, considering how much of Ward 1's and Ward 8's student population is off campus.
And then just one piece that I want to come back to, and it may be less relevant as your discussion is zeroing in more on the 8 ward configurations, but there was a question about taking into account future areas of growth in the city. This was a question that we asked internally early on in the process in terms of how much, as we're trying to work within the allowable deviations, if and whether we could account for future growth within the planned deviations. I think it's definitely a good factor for us to bear in mind, especially as we're thinking about if we're changing ward boundaries, how future growth in the city might add population in certain areas to help neighborhoods kind of feel more contiguous. I think it's definitely a factor we want to think about, but I believe, and I can circle back on this, like when you adopt a map, you have to be looking at the deviation as it is today, not as you would expect it to be in the future. So if you can still make a consideration of future growth work within the allowable numeric deviations, I think that that's a fine thing to consider.
Yeah, and I know Jean feels differently about this, but I think staying within the 10% and really only going up to the 10% if we've got some understanding of future growth that we're considering.
I should also mention that one of the other things that the Charter Change Committee is looking at right now is whether every time we redistrict, this really needs to be a charter change in and of itself, where we need to go to the legislature to have our maps changed. We've been working on a potential amendment to our charter, which would allow the council to initiate its own redistricting process. Of course, it would still have to go to voters, but it would allow us to potentially change maps more frequently than every 10-year census, which would allow for us to, I think, better accommodate some of these larger developments. When we saw that with Bayberry Commons in Ward 1, now potentially with Cambrian Rise, we're talking about potential development downtown, Trinity campus. I know in the South End, we're talking about the Innovation Overlay District. So it may ultimately end up being pretty well balanced, but hopefully we can maybe think about whether we can be more flexible outside of the every 10-year process.
So it's 11. Oh, Megan, do you want to
Go
go?
ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's 11:15 and I did want to save some time so we could get another date, though I realize without Councilor McGee here, that might be a little tricky. What I'm hearing is you absolutely want more options for the 8-ward map. And then I guess if there's any consensus on whether you'd like to see another 712 or another 714 or drop both of those, that would be great to figure out.
I think it might make sense to focus on the 8, but
I tend to agree.
knowing that that still gives us two options for maps.
I tend to agree as well. The 712 is definitely sort of a result of sort of a political result of political considerations. So I still worry without having an option outside of 8 that we get hung up in council discussion without a good way forward. But perhaps having just a couple of options for an 8-ward map might be a good way forward right now. And it doesn't mean that if we don't iterate any of these maps, I mean, it just means we're by taking them off the table, essentially we're dropping them as options for council discussion, or we're just not doing any additional work on maps that have been made. I mean, it seems like we're probably trying to rule them out for council discussion to keep us more focused, but they're still out there, in the world, I guess, if some folks wanted to, not in this group, but in the larger council, wanted to resurrect them, but I would hope they wouldn't.
And maybe I'm not to point this on you, but if you or one of us wants to at least update the council on like where we landed, so that folks are like, absolutely not, like, I can't handle the 7-ward. Like, if somebody else wants us to like keep talking about one of the maps and start talking about lines, I think we could, but I think it's hard to justify some of the other maps when the 8-ward map just seems to do more to keep things intact and simple, as Jonathan said.
I think from a staff perspective, it has been helpful to hear more of a clear statement about ruling out your intention to rule out the 12 at this point. I definitely hear that there are some considerations that the different iterations of 7 wards can offer that we keep coming back to. And I think from what I'm hearing today is not necessarily that they're completely off the table, but that for the immediate future, moving into your next working session, that you want to focus on the 8 wards. I think with the understanding that that means that at a staff level, we won't do any more work on the 7-ward options in anticipation of that meeting. So I think if you're in agreement with that, if your update to the other counselors suggesting that you're moving in the direction of looking at 8 wards raises any red flags, or at our discussion next time, if that raises red flags, we just need to bear in mind that this committee will have to, and staff will have to have adequate time to help you iterate some of the 7 wards in order to meet that deadline for having something for the council next month. So,
I'm comfortable with that, and I would also, I'm happy to update the council. And if there's a recording of this meeting, I could even link them to that. But I certainly will update the council. And so I guess the update, if Zariah and Ben concur, is that we're going to ask staff to for more iterations of an 8-ward map that attempt to, and the only thing that I heard was that we want to balance students better. Are there other things in the additional 8-ward map that we'd want to do?
Sorry, one second. I think there was some. So again, I would just ask us with the map to like think about all kinds of students, not just on-campus students. I don't know if there was a possibility. And I think maybe one more pitch on that for like equity is Ward 1 obviously is too big, and the 8-ward option is going to have to get cut down. And I think it would feel really weird to not only cut it down so drastically in some sections, but then add new sections to it that historically haven't been part of it. So focusing more on cutting down Ward 1 as opposed to like adding slivers again, like crossing Highway 2 and things like that. I don't know if there's, and I think this might help with the on-campus thing though. It's a little because the streets downtown don't necessarily like cut through, but along those lines, if we needed to like cut a section off of the lakeside of Ward 1 to cut further into the current Ward 8, same thing with Ward 3 to move it further south, and then make Ward 8 like basically scooch down towards the waterfront. I think that could be a way to move some of the students from Ward 6 if that's a concern that folks have. So I don't know if that makes sense, me trying to visually describe what's going on, but. And then I'm just curious, Mark, if you've heard anything about the preference between the, obviously this doesn't matter to me, but between the east-west split or the north-south split and the new North End.
People generally want the new North End to be divided along its sort of historic natural boundary, which is North Avenue, in as much as can be done. Well, with the understanding that just because of the population density in different areas, it has to wrap. I think right now it wraps sort of at the northern end, and I know there's maps that sort of wrap it at the southern end a little bit as well, potentially. So either one of those seems to be acceptable generally in the folks that I've talked to. But definitely like that better than a north-south split. An east-west split is preferable to a north-south.
Okay. That makes sense to me. And so my plan would be to, I think definitely make some maps with different allocations of students across the different wards. Hearing your concerns, Raya, about how Ward 1 would shift because of that. But then we can look more specifically about where we'd want the lines to be. I think it'd be easier if we had a couple different options to see what's possible.
And if I could just say, I mean, so in addition to the new North End considerations, obviously, I mean, you know, with the North Ave split, the boundary between the new North End and the old North End, and as we move further south here, you know, we've heard from a number of folks who are interested in more of a downtown ward. So I don't know if there's any possibility to keep that in mind in sort of wards 3 and 2 as they exist, to the extent they come down, whether or not there's any way to have a ward that extends more east to west within the downtown corridor there. And then I understand this is going to still be up for further consideration here, but I believe the two largest census blocks in the city are the athletic campus and Redstone. And I think it's very difficult for us to work on maps that consider those to be a part of the same block, right? That to the extent we're going to consider both Redstone and the athletic campus to have to move together, we're going to end up with the same problem, I believe, that we have with currently Ward 8. So I certainly understand, Zariah, the desire of folks within Ward 1 to not extend south of Route 2 there. But I also think there's a reality here where we're going to have to split the Redstone and the athletic campuses. Otherwise, we're just going to end up with another Ward 8 issue. So that's sort of my 2 cents. I mean, I don't know if they belong.
Do you think that's actually, so do you think that's actually true though? Because Ward 6 has a lot of housing, more affluent housing, which includes people who volunteer more. I'm not sure, whereas Ward 8 was a mix of a very small section of like affluent housing, a lot of lower income housing, and a lot of off-campus student housing. So I don't know that that's shifting Ward 8 to Ward 6 problem, because Ward 6 is a radically different rest of the ward than Ward 8 was, especially with off-campus students.
Well, I think part of the issue too is that, I know a lot of folks have been working with this district builder tool. I've sort of tooled around in there myself, but it seems like the data that's in there is not accurate to the population data that UVM has. It's difficult to rely on that. But I guess, again, I'm not saying I'm ultimately going to decide one way or another, but I would be interested in trying to figure out, like, is there really a way, if we consider both the athletic campus and Redstone campus, that they have to move together in one ward or another? What's the impact of that really? Because on that district builder tool, the two of them together are about 3,500 people. And if we're looking at an 8-ward map, there's no circumstance under which that's not going to be 60 to 70% of a ward's population.
So to your point, I will admit that the reason those blocks have moved together is because there are errors in the census blocks, and when you group them all together, the errors cancel each other out. I think going forward, I will look at a dorm by dorm level and correct those errors so that we can move things around more granularly. I think that makes a lot of sense. I do think that because of just like the size of the density, the size of the dorms, I think both of the wards up there would end up being about 50% on-campus students, even if we split the students exactly equally between them. And so there's still going to be a high percentage of on-campus students in Ward 1 and Ward 6, no matter how that split is made. But I think this is worth like putting a pause in this conversation to like see some actual maps. And we can talk more about that next time. That's fine, everybody.
But it is helpful to hear that, I mean, like, again, I'll just reiterate, when we have talked about the maps provided to you before, they've just been the first kind of highest level pass at how boundaries would move around. And we had really been holding off on getting into that dorm by dorm level of line work until we understood kind of where the priorities were. So I think this discussion is really helpful in illustrating that it is time for us to get into that work, and happy to do that with you, including in kind of a dynamic way at your next meeting. So
I just want to note that there's some commentary and questions in the Q&A that we probably want to capture for the purposes of feedback in this meeting.
okay.
Now that I'm looking at some of the 7-ward maps, I'm like, are they so bad? Sorry.
I do think that, Nancy, thank you. I think that we are going to have to get granular though on the dorms. So I appreciate that. I think that will help us move forward.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree.
I guess I was hoping to talk a little bit about scheduling the next meeting, but I don't know if that makes sense to do live, or I can send out some possible times via email.
Be good to have Joe there next time, and I don't know if we can schedule for him unless someone else can. I know I certainly can't. So,
and I understood that he's not coming back till the 28th, so I think it would have to be after that.
Yeah.
So could we doodle it?
Sure.
I think that would be best. Yeah. And just to note that basically from the 30th onward, I don't have any evening time. So like, just so folks know about us not scheduling unless we're doing it on like the 7th. I already have too many meetings.
Is understood that all of your evenings are very full. Is there a preference for doing this kind of mid-morning time? I mean, one of the other comments that we did here in the public forum was just about not doing this in person. And we actually had preferred to do this in person at a staff level, but rooms were all booked. So I don't know if the council, if it's easier for you, if we thought about doing it like kind of an earlier time in the morning, or something, would that help with your schedule? Or is this an okay time of day for planning in the future? or late afternoon, I should say, to kind of address the public facing concerns.
So if we do it in October, it's a little just because we don't work at City Hall, so that only means like additional travel time for us that's cutting into our workday if we're doing it in person. So if we're doing it in October, that makes it a little easier for me because I'm leaving my current role and won't be working full time there. But like, I don't know how Ben feels about that in terms of making it. So I'm fine with virtual. And I'm also fine. I don't know if there's a virtual option where we can just move all of the attendees to participants, to panelists so that they can be on camera and unmute when they want to. I'm fine with that. That would be preferable to me than trying to commute in addition to this time. Again, just because it cuts into the workday.
The expectation is that we're reporting back for the 17th, our meeting on the 17th. Is that right? Okay. I certainly hear and understand the concerns from folks with respect to public participation. If there are any evening meeting times available, even if it is on a Fridays, or I don't know if you said the 7th, can make that work probably in the late afternoon. But I will also note that obviously there's going to continue to be quite a bit of public participation and discussion with respect to whatever comes out of this committee, and we're certainly not making any decisions ourselves on behalf of the full council. And this will come forward to the full council in the context of a public hearing on these maps dedicated completely to it. So so folks will have a chance to weigh in on it one way or another. And if we do it midday or mid-morning, which is fine by me if those are the only times that are available, of course, it would be helpful, Nancy, I'm sure you agree with this, to any maps you come up with, getting them published and up on the agenda such that if folks want to submit any written comments, we can get those as well.
In terms of timing, I'm good with mid-morning. This worked for me. Although I was in my car just as the meeting started, but it still worked in theory, and it will continue to. But I'm also open to the sort of mid to late afternoon timeframe, if that works for folks, and if that helps increase the public's ability to attend as well. I don't know if Ben or Zariah have availability then, or if that's a difficult time.
So I just started teaching Colchester Middle School's cross country practice. So unless we do it after that, so if we had a remote meeting at 4 o'clock, I could make that work. Or if we want to do in person, like first thing in the morning, more like the mayor's like bagel meeting times, which might make it easier for other people to participate. That would work better for me. So either like 4 o'clock in person or 4 o'clock remotely or in person in the morning.
All
That
right.
makes sense to me.
Okay, great. We can send some doodle polls then for you that have some options like that. Okay. And we'll make sure to include Councilor McGee's availability for that discussion as well. Okay. Nancy, is there anything else that you needed from the council for the discussion today?
No.
Anything else from the counselors?
I
Okay.
thought this was a really productive work session.
It was very helpful from a staff perspective for us to be able to support your work going forward. So thank you very much for the time today, and we'll look forward to talking with you more about the 8 ward maps in a couple of weeks.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.